Luke Vekoso, Tevita Fatai Latu, known as Stephen, Sione Fatawa, Tevita Siolaa, known as David, Kolo Fekitoa, and Sione Felipe Totau, known as Mano, were schoolboys in Tonga, raised around ocean weather and family discipline, but still young enough to think a horizon was an invitation. In June 1965, they slipped away from their boarding school on Tongatapu with almost no preparation, a few sacks of bananas, a handful of coconuts, and a small gas burner. They aimed for adventure. Maybe Fiji, maybe farther. But by the first night, their boat was already failing in open water. And within days, they were not traveling anymore. They were drifting. The question was no longer where they wanted to go. The question was whether 6 teenagers could remain alive long enough to be found. They had not been trained for a survival documentary, where they were not equipped with a radio, a compass, or a plan for disaster. What they had was something more ordinary, and, under pressure, more rare: familiarity with scarcity, and a cultural instinct to share instead of compete. That mattered later. But in the beginning, it did not matter at all, because the sea did not negotiate with character. It only demanded physics. Their escape began as a small rebellion. St. Andrew's boarding school in Nuku'alofa was strict, repetitive, and predictable. In that kind of place, the rules could feel larger than the world itself. The boys were bored. They were restless. They wanted a story that belonged to them. So they ran. They stole a boat on short notice, about 7.3 meters, roughly 24 feet long, without the normal checks a careful sailor would do. They did not stock enough water. And they did not pack navigation tools. Some accounts later emphasized how casual the decision was, how thin the line between an adventure and an emergency could be when adolescents believed the ocean was a familiar neighbor. It was not. It was an indifferent system. By the time they anchored for the night, around 10 kilometers, about 5 miles north of Tongatapu, their sense of control still held. The sea looked calm enough to sleep beside. But that night, a storm broke their anchor rope. It was not a cinematic wave that flipped them instantly. It was worse. It was the gradual loss of control. The sail and rudder were destroyed by violent wind. The boat became a container instead of a vehicle. It held them in the water, but it no longer took them anywhere they chose. Over the next 8 days, they drifted for nearly 320 kilometers, about 200 miles, bailing water from a craft that was disintegrating in real time. The sun punished them in the day. Salt stiffened their skin. Lips cracked. Throats burned. The surface of the ocean became both mirror and threat, bright enough to sting the eyes and endless enough to erase direction. At night the temperature dropped, and their wet clothes turned heavy. They could not dry properly. They could not rest properly. Everything they did was interrupted by the same task, keeping the boat from filling again and again until their arms trembled. The countdown clock was brutal and simple. Water first, then food. They tried to catch fish. They tried to collect rainwater whenever clouds passed close enough to offer it. They shared what little they had, not because it was noble, but because uneven sharing would have led to panic, and panic would have ended them faster than thirst. 8 days at sea could feel like a year when every hour had the same taste of salt and fear. On the 8th day, they saw land. Not the friendly outline of an inhabited beach, but a hulking volcanic mass rising from the ocean, steep and rocky, more cliff than shore. It was Ata, remote, uninhabited, and considered unlivable by many modern standards. But the boys did not need comfort. They needed the ocean to stop moving under them. When they sighted Ata, they abandoned the boat and swam to shore over the next 36 hours, using planks salvaged from the wreck. It was slow, exhausting, and dangerous. The sea did not allow clean arrivals. It forced them to earn land. Mano was the first to reach shore, whereas he was so weak from hunger and dehydration he could not stand. But he called out that he had made it. One by one, the others dragged themselves onto rock. They were alive. They had escaped one environment only to enter another. The island was not a paradise. It was a closed system with limited fresh water and no human infrastructure meant to help them. Atta's cliffs rose sharply. The interior held a volcanic crater. The vegetation could be generous in pockets and barren in others. The sun could be merciless, and the wind could scrape moisture from skin. The ocean offered fish, but it also guarded the island with surf that punished mistakes. The boys' first shelter was not a cabin or a hut. It was a cave they dug by hand. They hunted seabirds for meat, eggs, and blood. Blood became a liquid resource when water was scarce, but something the body could use to keep going even if the mind rejected the idea. They were not proud of it. They were alive because they stopped caring about pride. By the end of the first weeks, survival stopped being an event and became a routine. That routine was their only defense against the island's slow violence. Instincts kicked in. They immediately began to organize. They gathered what they could salvage. They began to learn the island's shape. They began to look for a consistent source of water because without it, nothing else mattered. They watched the sky, not for beauty, but for rain. They searched for any trace of past human presence, tools, containers, anything that could turn the island from a hostile unknown into a manageable place. The consequence of drifting to a deserted island was not only isolation, it was ignorance. Where they did not know what resources existed there. They did not know what time of year meant for rainfall. They did not know how long they would be there. All they knew was that they were far enough away to disappear. Meanwhile, far from the cliffs, where the boys rationed thirst and counted days, Tonga moved on with a different kind of pain. People expected them to come back. Then days passed, then weeks. Families heard nothing. In time, the absence hardened into belief. In later retellings, it was reported that they had been given up for dead and that funerals had been held. The island did not tell them that. The island did not tell them anything. Back on Atta, the boys' early plan was simple. Survive today and make tomorrow possible. They built schedules, they divided labor, and they chose structure over chaos because chaos would have made the island feel even larger than it already was. According to accounts, they worked in pairs and rotated duties, garden work, kitchen work, and guard duty, with one of the most important tasks being the lookout for ships. This was the first "how could it get worse" loop. They had survived the ocean, but the island offered no water, so they adapted. They collected rainwater in hollowed-out tree trunks. They learned how to store it. When rain did not come, they suffered. They drank seabird blood when they had to. They did not dramatize it. They endured it. The second loop came from food. Seabirds and fish could sustain them, but not without risk. Climbing cliffs for nests meant falls. Fishing from rocks meant waves. Injury was always one mistake away, and on an uninhabited island, injury was not a complication. It was a clock. At night they sang. They prayed. They built a kind of psychological shelter because the physical one was never enough. Some later accounts described a makeshift guitar and songs composed during exile. Those were not luxuries. They were tools to keep despair from becoming the leader. Months passed. And then, after roughly 3 months, their situation changed. Not because the island softened, because the boys learned to see. They discovered the ruins of a village site, Kolomale, inside the island's volcanic crater after a 2-day climb. The climb itself was a survival event. 2 days meant exertion and exposure. It meant leaving the relative safety of what they knew on the shore and risking the unknown interior. But what they found made the risk worthwhile: remnants of earlier habitation, and resources that could support long-term survival: feral chickens, wild taro, and bananas. The island had a buried memory of human life, and the boys revived it. They were no longer simply stranded teenagers eating whatever they could catch. They became caretakers of a small, fragile system: garden, water storage, and fire. Fire became its own countdown. Without it, they would eat raw food again. Without it, they could not dry properly. Without it, nights would feel longer and minds would feel weaker. One of the boys, Stephen, who later became an engineer, managed to start a fire using 2 sticks, and by some accounts they kept it burning continuously for more than a year. That kind of continuity was not romantic. It was discipline. It meant someone always watched it, someone always fed it, someone woke up at night to check it. And the third loop arrived as false hope. At some point they tried to leave. They built a raft. It broke apart about 1 mile offshore. They were forced back. In retrospect, that failure saved them, because some accounts noted they believed they were in Samoa and had started sailing south into open ocean. The hope of escape would have become a death sentence. Their raft broke, and the island kept them. By then, their lives had become a system of small, repeated acts. Morning was food and water checks. Midday was labor. Afternoon was lookout and repairs. Evening was fire, cooking, and whatever rituals kept their minds from collapsing inward. Arguments happened. They were teenagers. But they managed them. In later interviews and reporting, the survivors described cooling off by separating, walking away, and returning. Or they described resolving grievances at night. They used structure the way other people used walls. And then came the closest thing their story had to a catastrophic loss. It was not death. It was the kind of injury that could have become death. Stephen fell from a cliff and broke his leg, according to retellings. The moment mattered not because it was sensational, but because it tested their entire system. A broken leg on an uninhabited island was a crisis that could have shattered them, physically, emotionally, and socially. But they carried him. They set the leg using sticks and leaves, according to accounts. They kept working while he healed. The injury turned time into a different kind of enemy. Healing required patience. Patience required food. Food required labor. And labor required cooperation from teenagers who were already exhausted. There was no time to fall apart. Not yet. Days crept forward into months. The boys grew stronger in some ways and weaker in others. Their bodies adapted to the labor. Their minds adapted to the repetition. But hope did not rise in a straight line. False hope appeared again in the form of ships. Sometimes a speck on the horizon looked like a vessel. They would prepare signals. They would watch. The speck would pass or vanish into glare. Each time, they had to reset. Not dramatically. Quietly. Survival demanded that kind of emotional discipline. The ability to return to routine after disappointment without letting disappointment become a reason to stop. Meanwhile, far from the crater where a permanent fire was kept alive, the outside world had no such routine. But for the families, the story was already finished. Morning had its own repetition, waking up with the knowledge, then losing it for a moment, then remembering again. The boys could not know that their names had already been spoken in that tense, past tense. Back on Ata, the island continued its slow interrogation of their discipline. Heat, thirst, and the constant risk of injury did not go away. But the boys' system improved. They built shelters. They maintained a garden. They kept a lookout. Some later reporting described a badminton court and a makeshift gym. Details that sounded almost impossible until you realized what they really were. ways to keep bodies strong and minds occupied when the alternative was staring at the ocean until despair felt like the only honest response. 15 months was not one long, dramatic struggle. It was hundreds of small ones. It was the decision to tend the fire even when it was boring. It was the decision to share water even when thirst made people selfish. It was the decision to walk away from an argument instead of escalating it. It was the decision to climb again, to hunt again, to collect rainwater again, to accept that today would look like yesterday, and that this was not a failure of imagination. It was the only way to stay alive. On September 11th, 1966, something changed. It did not change with a miracle beam of light. It changed with a human mistake by the island. Someone finally saw the evidence of their presence. Australian fishing boat captain Peter Warner approached Atta after noticing something odd: patches of burned grass on the cliffsides. In the tropics, fire did not usually start without a cause. Aunt Warner came closer. Through binoculars, he saw figures. Human figures. The boy's first experience of rescue was not an embrace. It was disbelief. Accounts described them as unkempt, naked, long-haired. Warner and his crew were cautious, reportedly because he had heard that criminals were sometimes marooned on remote islands. The distance between rescuer and rescued was not only water. It was suspicion. It was the strangeness of 6 boys emerging from a place where no one expected anyone to live. One of the boys swam out. Stephen spoke English. He gave names. He gave a story that sounded too unlikely to trust. In one reported quote, Mano later described how scared they were, how the boat did not put the ladder down at first, and how Warner tested them with photos.